Hi everyone, welcome to the November 16th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and this week on the podcast we're going to be looking back at last weekend's racing from around the continent actually, as there was quite a bit of nice graded stakes racing up at Woodbine this past week, and we'll actually start by recapping some races from there. We'll also discuss some racing that took place at Aqueduct, a couple stakes events on the turf at that New York venue, Churchill Downs, where there's some horses that ran some notable speed figures. Then we'll finish things up towards the end of the podcast with a couple of impressive two-year-old performances, one in a graded stakes out at Del Mar, and then a maiden winner down at Gulfstream Park. Craig, though, I'm glad you're able to join me on this podcast. I know things looked a little dicey when I saw that Elsie posted that photo on Twitter over the weekend, that you had a bit of a mishap, but glad everything's doing okay with you.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty well off now. My shoulder's still going to have to get an MRI, but it's at least usable. Mostly what has hurt is my pride.
Yeah, I can imagine those little mishaps. They definitely catch you by surprise and can wound you a little bit in both your pride and your body. But Craig, before we get into the recap of this past weekend's racing, I do just want to tie up a loose end from last weekend. We were talking about the Breeders' Cup. I know that we individually raised some questions about some fractions of those races, particularly with regard to the Classic. And I know that there's been some video timing that both you did and Randy Moss since then that confirmed that, especially in the Breeders' Cup Classic, there was an issue with that half-mile fraction. Anybody that thought that 45 and change half mile was a little bit out of step with the visual of Nick Scone making that easy lead, they would have been right to think that something was a little suspicious.
Yeah, for sure. Randy Moss posted some times he got from video. I got very similar. I think basically spot on, to be honest. It was a little bit tough to find races to time because Del Mar has been Trackus for a long time, and as we know, Trackus isn't precise like the beam is, so I had to go back and find some really old races, and the video's kind of shaky when you get back into 2012 and 2013. It's amazing how much technology's changed, but I was able to piece things together, and in the end, I'm just going to go back and time all of those Breeders' Cup races, start to finish again, and you're going to see some new pace figures for sure. We already had the Breeders' Cup Classic as pretty moderate. I'm sure it's going to get even more so because I did use the official fractions when I first did the numbers. Some other races are going to change too, the distaff, some of the turf sprints. So hopefully they can get this situation sorted. We're going to talk about another race later on the show that I believe had some issues. So not a great look, but it's something that we, as figure makers, we've learned to handle.
Yeah, and I just think it highlights how important it is to really pay attention to pace figures when you're talking about these races for a couple of reasons. Number one, I mean, as Craig was pointing out, there may be some timing issues, and whether or not those fractions get corrected the right way in the official charts, you can trust that Craig's pace figures are going to reflect the fractions that the video timing shows are accurate. And furthermore, the track at Del Mar on that Breeders' Cup Saturday, Craig, was playing extremely fast for that surface, and that's why some people who maybe watching the race in real time saw 23, high 45, or even now this revised 23:46 and would say, oh, that's a fast pace for a mile and a quarter. Gunrunner went the same fractions in 2017, so that was a fast pace. This is a fast pace. I think it's important to highlight just how fast this track was on Saturday, even compared to that 2017 Breeders' Cup, where I think Gunrunner went a mile and a quarter in 2:01 and change. Just a very different Del Mar surface than what we're used to that we saw on that Breeders' Cup Saturday.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that always surprises me is people will talk about final times and they realize they will run over different tracks. But when they talk about pace, they always resort to raw fractions. And obviously the speed of the track is reflected in pace figures just as much as it is in final time figures. So it's a dangerous thing to think that you can just look at raw fractions and know what was really going on. Personally, I use the figures and I also use the visual. I think you have to look at both things, how a horse was running, but it is important to account for the speed of the track. And as you mentioned, Del Mar was really quick this weekend, much, much faster than it was in 2017.
Yeah, I mean, I can say personally for me, it was a real aha moment when I realized how valuable pace figures are, because I used to be somebody who believed fully in speed figures, would look at the buyers a lot, and would just in an unsophisticated manner would be comparing raw fractions from race to race or track to track because there was no other tool that I had really investigated or was aware of. But once you kind of realize that pace figures are that tool, it makes you realize, wow, I was I was basically using a method that was kind of in a pre-speed figure era back in the 70s and 80s when people were comparing times without looking at the speed of the track. I mean, nowadays we look back at that era before speed figures and say, well, that was useless information. That was a useless comparison to make. And I think today people haven't quite bridged that gap with the pace figures, realizing that you can't just look at the raw fractions. You really do have to take into account not just the speed of the track, but Craig, you also take into account the run up, the specifics of the track configuration and the distance, how fast the track is playing on that day or at that specific time. So it's really valuable to look at the pace figures because a lot of factors go into them, and just merely looking at the raw final times, it's really an inadequate measure to make those comparisons.
Yeah, and honestly, there's not a lot of, not freely, we're not free, but there's not a lot of commonly available pace figures out there. I'd put ours up against anybody's. I know there are a couple competitors that have them, but I don't think they put near the work and the thought into it that we do at TimeformUS. So I do think there's still a learning curve for the public because there's been some pace figures around, but they just weren't very good.
Yeah, and if you're confused about pace figures and you want to check it out and you can look at some TimeformUS PPs, the adjusted fractions, I think, are a good starting place to just kind of see how you can make those comparisons from race to race, because I know, Craig, that's something that was put into the PPs to sort of make the pace figures a little bit easier to understand. So the adjusted fractions, it's not saying that this is what the time should have been. It's not saying there was a timing error. The adjusted fractions are just standardizing the pace figures based on the time of the race. So it's taking those raw fractions that you see and standardizing it for all tracks and all distances.
Yeah, exactly. They cause a lot of confusion with people, understandably so. It can be kind of a confusing issue. But the adjusted fractions are just so you can basically compare raw speed. Our pace figures are meant to alternate with distance, surface. So a 100 pace figure at 6 furlongs is faster raw speed than 7 furlongs, which in turn is faster than 100 at 9 furlongs. Because we're looking to show race shape, where we tell you how the pace was for that particular distance and surface. But when you want to look at how fast horses are actually going, the adjusted fractions are the way to go. They'll show you which horses showed the most raw speed.
Yeah, and just as an example that I was using a little bit before, because I was having this conversation with somebody on Twitter before about the importance of pace figures and talking about the Knicks Go race, having a little bit of a debate, and I pulled up this example of Gun Runner versus Knicks Go, because now when the fractions of Knicks Go's Classic are corrected, it's almost identical, the opening quarter and half, to what Gun Runner ran back in 2017. But if you look in the TimeformUS charts at the pace figures and the adjusted fractions for those two races respectively, even though the raw fractions are almost the same, the adjusted fraction for Gun Runner at the half is 46.6, and for Knicks Go, I believe it is 47.57. So that's almost a full second difference in the adjusted fractions, and that takes into account the speed of the track and all the other factors that we were mentioning.
Yeah, for sure. So let's not bore our listeners too much and get on to the races. But I appreciate you bringing it up. It's a good discussion, and I get asked a lot of these same questions on Twitter.
No, yeah, I think as you said, we're going to move on in just a second, but I think it's something that's really good to demystify a little bit and to really dissect, because I think it's something that we talk about a lot on this podcast. Like, people are hardcore TimeformUS users and they already know what we're talking about. Like, they use these tools for their own handicapping. And I'm sure many people who listen to this do, but I think it's good to sometimes explain all of this stuff, because I know some people come in with some misconceptions. So it's good to, I think, create that base line of understanding about how all of this works. Let's get into the recap, Craig. And as I said, we're going to start up in Canada, where they actually ran 3 graded stakes this past weekend. A couple of them on Saturday. We actually talked about one on our stakes preview that we did for DRF last week, but we'll get to that, the Maple Leaf, in just a second. I think the most impressive stakes performance that we saw on Saturday at Woodbine was Lady Spite Spear winning the Grade 2 Beth's Arabian, going 7 furlongs. Craig, this 3-year-old filly, she's now undefeated in 4 career starts, and she transferred her good turf form to synthetic here and beat some older runners.
Yeah, this was a really nice performance from her. As you said, she's undefeated. I hate using that term for lately raced horses, but when you get up to 4, I think it's pretty legit. She's done everything really easily. She's going to wind up with, I think it's a 109 TimeformUS speed figure. The final time was even quicker than that, a 117. Since we've gone down the rabbit hole of pace and speed figures, I kind of mentioned to you offline, this is something we're going to be changing when the year changes. We're not going to penalize these horses that win easy on a slow pace. And it's not so much, it was something that worked for a long time. It made the figures better, but you have to adjust with the game. And I think riders have gotten more conservative and these slower paces are more common. And it's not a good idea anymore to knock these numbers down so much. So Lady Spear is one I would definitely judge more on that 117 final time figure than that 109 overall number.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We just don't see the kind of pace meltdowns or extremely fast paces that we used to see routinely in this game, especially in North American racing and at a lot of the high-profile circuits. And up at Woodbine, it's rare that you see a fast pace in one of these races because that Tapeta surface just doesn't really play to that running style. So I agree. I think it makes sense to base a lot of these sprint figures, especially on the synthetic tracks, more on those final time numbers. And yeah, Lady Spear, a 3-year-old filly getting a 117 final time rating. That's pretty legit. She had not run that fast on the turf prior to this, but keep in mind, 2 of her 4 races came as a 2-year-old, and she is a horse that early on looked like she was going to be a good one. I think she was one of the early favorites for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies turf last year. Obviously, she never made it to that race, had some setbacks, only made 1 start as a 3-year-old before this, but she seems like she's really going good right now for Roger Attfield. So I know the season's ending at Woodbine. We'll see if they decide to take this one to Gulfstream or somewhere else. But she definitely seems like she's good enough to branch out from that Canadian circuit.
Yeah, and the one thing that really stuck out to me is she's a 3-year-old. She tackled older horses in her return to the racing, but that was just a non-winner of 2 allowance where I would even argue 3-year-olds probably have an advantage if older horses are still trying to get through that condition. But to jump up and beat olders as easily as she did in this spot was really impressive to me.
Moving on to the other graded stakes on Saturday at Woodbine, that was the 10 furlong Grade 3 Maple Leaf for the fillies and mares. And Craig, I don't think it was a big surprise that Mark Casse won this race because he had 4 entrants in here, but I was a little surprised that the winner was as dominant as she was because it looked like a super competitive race coming in, but Sky Gaze, she just trounced them.
Yeah, she did, and she also ran a very good figure. She got a 113. This is a case where we do upgrade because it's a route race. We upgrade for the slowish pace and the very fast finish that she had. And what was most impressive to me is she was just drawing away from the field. So really big effort from her. I think that 113 is her career best, and I'm not sure what the plans are for her. As you said, Woodbine is closing pretty soon, but promising 4-year-old filly. But still a little hard to explain what happened to her last time at 3-5. But as we talked about on the forecast, sometimes those really slow pace races just give wonky results, and maybe she didn't like it. This was a much, even though it was moderate, it was still a much quicker pace, and she showed her dominance.
Yeah, this seems like a natural progression from her race 3 back in the Belle Mahone when she had won so impressively. But like you said, a perplexing loss as the heavy favorite last time, but she got right back on track here and handled a 1.25 mile distance. This is a really big, strapping daughter for American Pharoah. I questioned a little bit whether she was going to be able to get the distance given her pedigree because she had a lot more speed on the dam side, but she showed that she could certainly handle it here, especially given the way that the race was run, where she was able to use that speed to sprint away at the end. I thought Sister O'Toole ran on well for second. She had to negotiate a little bit of traffic coming from last place to get up here, but it was just kind of a blanket finish in behind Sky Gaze. Nobody was in the same league as the winner. And, Craig, I wonder if Mark Casse will decide to maybe try her on dirt at some point. I think it's been established that she's one of these synthetic horses that's not a turf horse because they tried that a few times early in her career and that just didn't work out at all. But she has plenty of dirt pedigree, and given the way that she's doing right now, I wonder if they might go for some bigger targets.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see. I know he usually has a big stable foal down at Gulfstream, and it would be interesting. And you make a good point. Just because a horse handles synthetic doesn't mean they're going to like turf. That's a common misconception out there. Some do, some don't, but I think it's very horse specific. Some just as easily transfer to dirt as opposed to turf. So yeah, I personally want to see her give a shot. You'd hate to see a horse laid up because just because the season's ending at Woodbine when they're in this good a form.
We saw last year's Queen's Plate and Prince of Wales winner Mighty Heart in action on Sunday at Woodbine in the Grade 2 Autumn Stakes, and this is just such a cool horse, Craig. He clearly loves to win. He's got so much heart, and he was really game. He took a lot of challenges at different points in this race and fended them all off, and even that last challenge from Sir Winston right at the end.
Yeah, and he's going to get a decent figure for this. I'll have the official later today, but probably about a 115. Just a really tough performer. He was able to set that pace, which isn't always what you want to do on the synthetic, especially around 2 turns, but just a really nice effort from him. And he's another one who's shown he can handle dirt and he doesn't like turf at all. So I'll be curious to see what they do with him. Another that's in good form. He's won on the dirt this year at Churchill. He ran a really nice race in the West Virginia Governor's Cup, so maybe he would ship south as well.
Yeah, Mighty Heart, an easy horse to root for. If people don't know his story, he just has one eye. I think he lost his other eye as a foal. And while that doesn't hinder a lot of thoroughbreds' performances, we've seen plenty of one-eyed thoroughbreds excel over the years. It's nice to be able to root for a horse that overcame some adversity like that. Craig, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this entire series of older horse races up at Woodbine, the Durham Cup, the Autumn, the Dominion Day, I feel like they used to all be different distances in the past, but this season they're all carded at a mile and a 16th, and I'm not sure that really worked in the favor of runner-up Sir Winston, who probably wants to go a little farther than a mile and a 16th. He just seemed like he didn't get going until the race was basically over this time. He was running on well at the end, but just couldn't get up past Mighty Heart going this distance. They've been campaigning him just at Woodbine this season, but I wonder if he's one that they might try dirt with again in the future.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. He certainly has shown that he's run well on dirt before. I do think there's one more older horse stake there at a longer distance. I would have to check the Woodbine stake schedule. I'm sure some of our listeners could fill us in on that, but it feels like there is one more to come towards the end of the year.
Let's move on to Aqueduct, where, as I was saying at the top of the show, they ran a couple of turf stakes this past weekend. The feature on Saturday was the Artie Schiller going a mile, and they did get plenty of rain in the New York area on Saturday, both early in the week and a little bit, I think, Friday into Saturday, which caused the turf course to be, I think it was listed good. It was probably on the yielding side, given some of the times, Craig. I forget what the track condition rating was, but I think it was somewhere in the middle of that 1-10 range, and I guess the winner of this race, Mandate, who went off at 46-1, must have just loved the going, because I don't know where this race came from based on his prior form.
Yeah, you called it. It was a 5 on the track condition rating, and this was a very tough speed figure to make because, as you said, there was rain. There was only one other race on the course, and it was clearly under much different conditions. When you look at the times of the races, there was no way to relate the two at all. So I had to decide either the 12-horse Mandate ran the race of his life or he ran his best race and every other single horse in the field just ran a complete clunker. So I'm always going to side with the statistics, the most likely, and that was that Mandate ran the race of his life. Maybe it was the footing. I have no idea. It's just one of those that's really tough to tell. But if you assume the other horses ran about their usual race, it put him at a 121. So that's what I went with.
Yeah, it's just a hard one to explain. When I was handicapping this race, it seemed kind of ridiculous this horse was even running in here. He had been a $25,000 to $40,000 claimer that had failed for Todd Pletcher, failed for Wayne Potts. He's in this new barn of Robert J.W. Johnston, a trainer that does have Woodbine roots, but is now based at Penn National, and he's run 2 races in a row for the new barn that are just completely out of step with his prior form. Make of it what you will. I posted some stats for this trainer from Formulator, his recent stats versus his prior stats. He's turned around the form of a lot of horses in his barn recently, whereas that hadn't been the case in the past. So, some trainers just go through hot streaks at times. We've seen it with a lot of trainers. They just have a run of good luck. So we'll see if it's if Mandate's able to hold this form in the future. And obviously, Craig, as you were saying, sometimes the track condition, when it's this wet on the turf course, it can produce some wacky results, and that probably contributed to the long shot winning as well.
Yeah, for sure. And it's the kind of race when he comes back, I'm not going to bet him off that 121 unless he ran on a similar course. I'll take my chances and we'll see. This race actually kind of reminded me of that Parks Turf Sprint where the claiming horse won. And I don't say that because that horse was subsequently DQ'd due to a violation. But it just reminded me of that figure making wise where it didn't make a lot of sense. Either every horse regressed or he ran the race of his life. So I'm always going to side with the one where the most horses run similar figures, but it's definitely one that I'm not going to have a lot of faith in.
Yeah, and just wrapping up this race, I want to say, Mandate, even though he was a huge price, he did not get lucky to win this race. He was wide around both turns, something that you typically can't do on the inner turf course at Aqueduct. He covered more ground than anybody and still ran away from this field like he was just a new horse coming into the race at the 8th pole. So, a surprising performance from this guy. He obviously loved the going and loved the situation on Saturday, so we'll see if he's able to reproduce this form in the future. Craig, I think we did see a winner that got a little bit lucky with the trip on Sunday in the Winter Memories, as Plum Ali. Got to give full credit to the connections. I don't know who's the one that made this tactical decision, Christophe Clement or rider Manny Franco, but somebody hatched a plan to send this deep closer to the lead in a situation where there really was no pace at all on paper, and they took advantage, changing this one's running style to go wire to wire.
Yeah, we talked quite a bit about pace figures earlier, and I have to say there's no set of pace figures in the world that would have put this horse on the lead early. But yeah, great move by the connections, whoever made that decision, be it Christophe Clement or Manny Franco. They took advantage of a race that had very little pace. We had it coded as a race that didn't have a lot of speed, and good on the connections. She had shown a little more early speed in the past last out, but still hard for me to rely on that and say it indicated she was going to be up front. I think it was just a strategical decision. She ran a 1:16 TimeformUS speed figure, which matches her career best. And personally, we've talked about many times, I wish more connections would do this and try to put a little more speed into their horses, because horses that just plummet to the back like she usually does take the worst of it. And her best performances actually came early in her career when she stayed up pretty close. So it was a good move for sure.
Yeah, I know Christophe Clement is a trainer who has those European roots, and he's reluctant to do this with one of his horses. He typically just rides them the way that they always are ridden, whether they have pace in their favor or not. But sometimes, you just get fed up with a horse like Plum Ali, who keeps getting compromised by slow pace after slow pace. And sometimes when you change something up, it does work for a horse. I know Chad Brown's figured this out quite a bit recently with some horses that have really responded well to showing speed that he used to rate in his barn. Tribovan comes to mind immediately, Blowout. And I'm not saying that Plum Ali is going to turn out to be a need-the-lead kind of horse like that, but it's good to know that your horse has that kind of versatility where they can show some tactical speed and still produce that closing finish in the lane. And that's what happened here, as she was able to hold on to win this race by 3/4 of a length. I wouldn't say that there were huge excuses in behind her. I think the one horse that maybe was most compromised by Trip, Craig, was the number 4 Gam's Mission, who did stumble at the start and really was the only one to make up a significant amount of ground from the back of the pack. I also want to give a shout out to White Frost, a horse that we had liked last winter, and she was returning from the layoff here. She had to briefly wait in traffic in upper stretch, but she saved a lot of ground and just thought this was a good starting point for her.
Oh, no doubt. I thought she ran a really good race in here coming off that break. Just a good effort. The pace wasn't, we don't have it coded in blue or anything, but it was moderate. So just some pretty good efforts in here, but I will be curious to see what happens with Plum Ali coming out of here and what they do with her, because like I said, it's not like she went to the front and just set dawdling fractions. For that course, it was fairly honest. So I would expect her to be more forwardly placed, not necessarily leading, but more forward in the future races.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it was not an extremely slow pace, but I mean, a couple factors that you have to consider, I think, are there still was plenty of give in the turf course on Sunday's card, and typically you don't see those sprint-like come-home fractions over a turf course that's rated 6 on a track condition scale. And furthermore, the inner turf course at Aqueduct, just generally with those tighter turns, it plays more to horses that show speed and are able to save ground the entire way. Actually, the 1, 2, 3 finishers in this race, if you watch the replay, rode the rail the entire way. So I think that though all those factors together, the moderate pace, the inner turf course, the give in the ground, it just contributed to nobody being really able to close in this race. So even though you don't see those blue fractions, I think there are enough reasons to say that a horse like Gam's Mission was compromised.
Oh, for sure. And just to backtrack a little bit to that previous race, the Artie Schiller, so I meant to bring this up at the time. You were saying that he was legitimately the best horse on that day. One thing I noticed was the 2-3-4 finishers were 1-3-4 at the first call. So it's not like it was a big setup for him. He was legitimately the only horse doing any running at the end of that race.
Another race from this past weekend at Aqueduct that was a non-stakes event that took place on Saturday was an allowance race, nominators of 1 going 6 furlongs. And Craig, not a race that got a particularly high speed figure, but I think we both do want to highlight the winner, Happy Medium, because he was a horse that was so impressive, breaking his maiden 2 back when he got that gigantic 121 TimeformUS speed figure, came back in this spot and won at odds of 1-5, regressing quite a bit from a speed figure standpoint, but pace had everything to do with that.
Yeah, and actually the final time figure was a 110, which is still a regression, but not as much. And it's, again, what we talked about, penalizing horses for being up front on a very slow pace. And that is, in my opinion, why the figure came back as low as it did. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately, it's a tricky situation because this isn't one of those races where I could use that P notation and just boost the whole field up, because the rest of the horses basically ran what they always do. Happy Medium just kind of was content to sit a little bit off the pace through those just crazy slow fractions and draw away at the end. So I'm not going to penalize him in my head for running only that 110 final time number. I think it was 100% the function of pace, and I still think he's a really promising horse who's probably ready for stakes competition.
Yeah, you're looking at the pace figure line of this race, and when you've got a horse going the opening quarter in just around an 80, it's basically impossible for a horse to run another 120 TimeformUS speed figure in that situation. I mean, you'd have to be coming home in 21 change or 22. It's just not something you see in dirt racing, where a horse starts out that slowly in a 6 furlong race and is able to achieve a higher speed figure at the end of the race. So I think it's just one where the connections were looking to get an easy victory, not really interested in emptying the tank on Happy Medium, and he'll probably get back to a faster speed figure next time.
Yeah, and nobody else was interested in emptying the tank either. It almost looked like everybody was just trying to figure out how to get second instead of trying to win the race, which maybe it's the right decision. I mean, nobody was beating Happy Medium on this day.
A little earlier in the week at Aqueduct, actually on opening day of this meet, November 11th, the Thursday card, we saw a maiden race going 7 furlongs. A really interesting group of runners, some horses coming off layoffs. The Todd Pletcher-trained Waxman, who had been second to Pipeline at Saratoga in his debut. He was the heavy favorite in this race, but it was the returning core conviction of 4-year-old Gelding, who was just making the second start of his career at the end of his 4-year-old season for Chad Brown. Had made one prior start on the turf, but he really took to the dirt here, Craig, coming back off the layoff.
Yeah, this was some effort from him. He wound up with a 117 TimeformUS speed figure, and it kind of matched the visual. I mean, he won by 5.5 lengths. The pace was really solid, and he just blew this field away. And there were some pretty decent maidens in here, horses who had run triple-digit figures before, and Waxman and Rock Sugar. So good effort from him, and one I really look forward to coming back. This was a day, it was a little bit tricky, I would say. The 7th race there was only a few dirt races, I think 3 dirt races on the card. But this race and the second race matched up perfectly. I think the track changed a bit between that and the 7th race, with a couple intervening turf races. So I used a different variant. I only bring that up because I saw Beyer, he didn't have the figure near it as high, and I know some people will ask me about that, but it's one of those I'm really confident in the figures for all three dirt races because they just lined up so well.
Yeah, I mean, we've already gone in the weeds a lot on this podcast, so I don't want to do it again. But just suffice to say, speed figure making at Aqueduct is very tricky on the dirt course there, especially as we get into the winter months. It's something that I know Craig has harped on quite a bit. And if you look at the Beyer speed figures and Craig's numbers, there's just, I think when you're making the Aqueduct speed figures, maybe a little bit of a difference of philosophy. I know, Craig, that you're more willing to say that the track changed throughout the day at Aqueduct because we see that happening so often. So it's not a big leap at Aqueduct, whereas it might be at other tracks, to say that things just changed as the temperatures change throughout the day.
Yeah, and generally I don't look at the Beyer speed figures, but when that one came up at 117, I was just curious to see how they would handle it because we don't get a lot of maidens breaking their maiden with a 117. But I have no problem with that number. I thought it was a really good performance, and I expect this is a horse with a bright future.
Let's move on to Churchill Downs, where the feature race last weekend was Saturday's Dream Supreme Stakes. And Craig, this race lost a little bit of its luster when Sconson was scratched on Saturday morning. I know the trainer said that she just wasn't doing right in the days leading up to it, so he wanted to err on the side of caution and save her for a 2022 campaign. So good to hear that Sconson will be coming back next year, but that really gave Bells the One the chance to shine on Saturday. And maybe she had to work a little bit harder than some people thought she might have to win this race, but I mean, it's not like she ever wins by 5 lengths. She always keeps it pretty close.
No, exactly. That's what she always does. And I think once we saw the opening quarter pop up, it was pretty obvious what was going to happen. I mean, if you were sitting there with a 6.5 exacta, you could probably head to the window because we talked about it on the forecast. I don't think Club Car's ever going to beat Bells the One if they both get honest trips, even though there's only a 1 length difference and a 1 point in the speed figures. Sometimes you just can't spell everything out with a number, and Bells the One is clearly superior in my opinion. She got a 113 for the win here, which is pretty much what she always runs. Got a nice pace set up for a change, and really good horse. It's a listed stakes, so it's kind of a listed stakes kind of figure at 113. So I'm not sure if this is the ceiling. Maybe Bells the One on her best day is kind of a grade 2, where if she gets a really nice setup, she could run some down. But just a good, solid runner that always shows up.
Yeah, I believe she does have that one prior grade 1 victory in her past, but
Right.
I mean, generally she's not running those kinds of speed figures. Deep closers that are sprinters generally don't. They just do what they have to do to win. But I mean, she definitely knows how to win. She's now won half of her 22 career starts. I think at the 6 furlong distance in particular, her record is now 7 for 8 with a second. So she's a really consistent, admirable win machine, and just nice to see her add another one to the win tally. That was all the stakes racing at Churchill this past weekend, but there were some notable speed figures in allowance races early in the week, Craig, including a couple on Friday at Churchill. Super Quick, a Norm Cassie trainee, won her 3rd in a row, and she's just a 3-year-old filly, but she ran a pretty nice speed figure winning this allowance race.
Yeah, she did. She's going to wind up with hold on, I lost the click here, a nice 117. So I'll right there with the final time of that race we talked about in Woodbine with Lady Speightstown. So, yeah, good promising filly.
Yeah, and the track at Churchill on Friday had taken a lot of rain, I think, right in the middle of the card. It changed a little bit because we're going to talk in a second about another race from Friday that I think the track was actually run under completely different conditions. So maybe things changed a little bit. I don't know if there was a bias situation. I wasn't paying that close attention, but Super Quick, it seemed like Joe Talmo was intent on getting her right over to the rail as soon as she broke on top, but she quickly established and just never stopped. And it's not like the race was a merry-go-round behind her. The runner-up closed from last place to get up for second. So, I mean, Super Quick has now won 3 in a row and just seems like she's doing really well right now.
Yeah, it was an interesting track. As a matter of fact, I gave it the C condition. There was definitely a change. It started raining late in the card, and maybe that influenced the track. But it's not like she hasn't been in good form. She's won on fast tracks. She's won on sloppy tracks. 117, I will be a little curious to see if she can back that up because we do have her last race coded in red when she went wire to wire on a speed favoring track. The time before was in the slop. So she may be one as good as the figure looks if she catches a fast track in a race with some speed that I'd want to take a shot against.
And it was a good weekend, or I should say past week, for Norm Cassie. Aside from just winning with Super Quick, he also had Candy Tycoon win on Friday, and I saw on Twitter he also became a new dad, so that's all good stuff. But, I mean, his other winner on Friday, Candy Tycoon, Craig, he was also pretty impressive, winning second off the claim for Norm with a 118 Timeform US speed figure.
Yeah, it was a big effort from him, as you say, second off the claim. He was in that allowance race that we highlighted on the forecast, won by Beau Luminaire. It was a race with a slow pace. He was kind of back off of it, didn't get to do his best running. So good number from him. As you mentioned, this was before the rings came. The track was still fast, so couldn't really use the same variant for this race as some of the others, but it was certainly a good performance, and I would imagine he'll be showing up in some stakes company if he can run back to that 118.
Yeah, and Candy Tycoon also contributed to a 6-win day for Tyler Gaffleone on that Friday card. So just an amazing riding performance by him. I believe he won with all 6 of his mounts that day. I think he wasn't riding in the 3 other races. So that's just a really novel and amazing achievement for a jockey. Yeah, Candy Tycoon, I know we had talked on, I think, a recent podcast about his race 2 back when he didn't make the lead. But he's not a need the lead type. He had never been. He's kind of a stalker. And he just kind of built on the good form that he'd already had when he was previously with Todd Pletcher. So maybe this is one that Norm Cassie and the new connection could do something with, because this is definitely a step in the right direction for him. One of the race from Churchill last week that we should discuss, an allowance race from Wednesday that was won by the 3-year-old Defeater. Craig, this is a horse that has had some stops and starts in his career. I think in just his 4th career start, they took a shot running him in the Oklahoma Derby. That didn't quite work out, but he dropped back into allowance company here and also back to 1 turn, and he was a pretty impressive winner.
Yeah, he won easy by over 7 lengths, got a 111 Timeform US speed figure. And what impresses me with a horse like this is even though he just keeps improving, his speed figures improved every single time out. And particularly this one, when he had run his worst race, I say worst by results because he was 6th, beaten 8 3/4 lengths in the Oklahoma Derby, but he ran a 109 speed figure, and sometimes that'll take something out of a horse, but it didn't in his case. He bounced right back, ran a 111 here, so this is a promising 3-year-old.
Yeah, it looked like he was working a little bit hard to get there coming to the quarter pole, but once they straightened away on the stretch, he just galloped away from this field really powerfully, opened up at the end. It did fall apart a bit behind him. Hunt the Front, who's a deep, deep closer for Nick Zito, he was able to get up for second, so the pace did fall apart, despite the fact that the fractions didn't look blazingly fast. But Defeater just seems like a promising horse for Tom Amoss that now that he's putting some races together, seems like he really is coming around, so a 4-year-old that you can look forward to. Let's close out the podcast with a couple of 2-year-old performances. We'll begin with a stakes race out in California at Del Mar, the Grade 3 Bob Hope from Sunday. And Greg, watching this race in real time, when the fractions popped up on the screen, I know there were some raised eyebrows because anytime you see 2-year-olds going 43 and 2 to the half mile, you're wondering, is that real? It didn't necessarily look like they were going that fast. The pace, though, did kind of come apart at the end, and that allowed the Bob Baffert trained Messier to just draw away from this field late.
Yeah, I timed these from video. I don't think the fractions are right, but that said, they're still really quick. It was not as egregious an error as some would think. I have it at probably a couple fifths of a second at both the quarter and the half. The final time was fine, so no problems on that end. This is one my assistant does, of course, as I like to say. He will do the speed figures, but if I had to guess, I would guess Messier's going to get a 107. The fractions are still going to be coded in red because they were still sub 22 and sub 44. No doubt they were flying up front, and Messier just got an absolute dream trip from the back of the pack.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess it's up to you how much stock you want to put in a race where Bob Baffert had 3 of the 4 entrants, and a couple of them were speed horses, and Messier was just kind of able to swoop the field on the outside, getting a perfect setup. But the winner looks like he is the best horse coming out of this race, and I would imagine he's the one that Bob Baffert will try to win, get another Los Alamitos Futurity with. I know that's a race that he typically does point for at the end of the season, and I mean, Messier, while he's only sprinted so far, he definitely does have a pedigree to get some extra distance, being by Empire Maker, their stamina on the dam side. So he's one that would probably be pretty formidable moving on to that race.
Yeah, I do think the runner-up, Forbidden Kingdom, ran pretty well in here. I mean, he got pressed by the other 2 Bob Baffert horses and was able to fight them off and easily run second in here. So I don't want to knock him too much. I thought he ran well. He's probably going to get as big a figure as the winner did. I just don't think he's one that's likely to stretch out like Messier is.
And Craig, when I was crawling through the charts this past week, creating our rundown for this podcast, sometimes a speed figure or just a performance that you see in the chart will pop out at you that you were not expecting. And I was just glancing over the results at Gulfstream on Saturday, and a maiden race in the middle of the card was won by a 2-year-old first-time starter from Mark Casse, Strategic Bird, who just basically ran off the screen, winning by more than 12 lengths. And I added to the rundown. I said to you, I wasn't really sure what the speed figure was going to come back as, but it looked like it might be a fast race, and definitely one that seems like she could have a future.
Yeah, and this is one I originally underrated. I'm actually really glad you brought this up on the rundown, because it was the only race that day at 5.5 furlongs for some reason that I've never been able to figure out. Those are always tricky at Gulfstream Park, and when I started looking through the field and realizing that it wasn't at 6 furlongs, it's one I probably should have rated higher. So I'm going to go back and revisit this one, but I think it's going to be in the mid hundreds actually for a 2-year-old Florida bred maiden. Pretty impressive performance. I'll tweet out what the exact figure is, but I'd probably guess somewhere around a 105. And when I do that, it means all the other horses pretty much ran what they've been running, or at least close to it. If you look at the chart now, that's what kind of jumped out at me. I had some 2-year-olds regressing in their second start. Now, I just don't think that's the case. It doesn't happen very often. So impressive to win by almost 13 lengths, and the number is going to look better.
Yeah, and this horse was a bit of a secret, going off at 8-1 in this race, but I mean, you could see the cat was out of the bag as soon as they opened the stalls, because she was up by about 2 lengths over this field in the blink of an eye, and she just widened her advantage throughout. Really, some horses tried to go with her, including the runner-up, who, as you said, had really solid prior form coming into this. I think having 2 seconds in a row by a length or 2, and she was second again here, but she was beaten a dozen lengths after trying to go with this horse, who just ran away from them with ease. Strategic Bird, and the rider was barely asking her for anything in the final eighth of a mile of this race. So one that seems like she has a future. Again, based on this performance, maybe she's just a pure sprinter, but her pedigree would say otherwise. She's from the first crop of Noble Bird, a son of Birdstone who wanted to go long. On the dam side, it's all stamina breeding. The dam is by a Fleet Alex. There's a lot of Phipps pedigree on the dam side. I think her third dam is Educated Risk. So an interesting filly that debuted down in Florida, where we don't typically see that many good ones debuting at this time of year. But, Mark Casse can handle a good horse.
Yeah, and I was about to say, it's getting to be close to that time where we're going to start seeing some better performances at Gulfstream. This one definitely a little earlier than normal, but once the calendar turns in December, we're going to start seeing some runners show up in that warmer climate.
Well, that's all the racing to recap this week. As usual, Craig and I will be back later in the week to do the TimeformUS forecast. And as usual, with kind of recovering from that Breeders' Cup week, I think we haven't looked ahead too much yet. I know that their feature on Saturday at Aqueduct is the Red Smith, a race that usually comes up with a pretty good field, so we'll see how the card's constructed around there. But a lot of the Aqueduct cards that I've been looking at least through Thursday and Friday this week, have been excellent wagering cards, some big fields. I would definitely look at Friday's card at Aqueduct if you haven't yet. Some good races there. But so we'll see if Saturday's as strong as that. Maybe we'll find a multi-race sequence there or somewhere else. But Craig, we'll look through it and find something to talk about on that TimeformUS forecast later in the week.
Yeah, you know me, I'm flexible. That's a good part about making speed figures for so many tracks. I get familiar with a lot of the horses, and even the ones my assistant does. We always talk about them together. So I do have a pretty good feel for most of the tracks.
Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast on Friday.